All right, welcome everybody to the second session in the Policy Matters series. Today's session will be on truth and reconciliation. My name is Anika Zauni and I'm the Community Engagement and Gender Equality Specialist at OCIC. And it's our pleasure to co-host this event in partnership with the Northern Council for Global Cooperation, as well as have the presence of some incredible young people here today. Before we get started, I do want to do a quick land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that OCIC's office sits on the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation in Toronto, or in Tiggeronto, or as it's known along settler lines as Toronto. I myself am actually joining from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe on two-row wampum belted dish with one spoon territory, known along settler lines as St. Catharines, Ontario. When I think about land acknowledgements and when I think about the need to acknowledge land and honor the Indigenous people who came before and still live on this land today, it actually prompts me to think beyond just naming the communities and Indigenous peoples whose land I live, work, play on, but actually think more intentionally about how I can use this knowledge that I'm a settler on this land as a framework to engage with whatever seminar, webinar, event that I'm in. Of course, I'm not the expert on this, and it's a learning process for me. And today we have the honor of learning and hearing from Indigenous youth. So I just invite all of you who are settlers on this land, like myself, to really think through how you're going to engage with today's session, not just to learn, but also to learn how to put in practice and learn how to better take action as allies alongside and in solidarity with the Indigenous communities and Indigenous people close to you. I hope that today's workshop and session will be a way for you to move beyond words to action. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you all our panelists for today. We have firstly Sarah Hanson, who unfortunately is unwell and will not be able to join us today, but I still want to introduce her and have all of you hear who she is and hopefully reach out to her in other ways so that you can hear from her expertise. Sarah uses she, her pronouns, is Anishinaabe from Biigtigong Nishnaabeg, currently living and working on the traditional lands of Fort William First Nation, known as Thunder Bay. She holds a biology degree from Queen's University and uses the knowledge she gained there to connect with other climate activists around the world while simultaneously providing an Indigenous perspective. For the past few years, Sarah has worked on creating spaces for Indigenous youth to connect and learn about climate change, sustainability, and reconciliation. Sarah is also involved with OCIC and was involved last year as one of the allies for a Youth Policymakers Hub. And so it's a shame we won't get a chance to hear from her today, but I highly encourage you to follow Sarah on her journey as she shares with so many people her perspective and her knowledge on climate change and sustainability. Our second panelist for today is Skaydu.û Jules, Autum Jules, who is from the Teslin Tlingit Council First Nations in the Uconn territory. I will leave it to her to introduce herself more fulsomely when she begins her presentation, but it is such a pleasure to have you join us here today. And our final panelist is Jenna Robar, who is a young Tlingit, Mi'kmaq, and Acadian woman from Unama'ki, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. She's a leader and change maker in her communities, both in Nova Scotia and in Toronto. She works for the federal government and is a speaker, and she spends time traveling pre-COVID to speak with organizations and with advocacy across Turtle Island. She has worked with newcomer youth. She's done sessions on Indigenous life and culture in Canada and has worked with the United Nations Association of Canada and with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to create awareness about the calls to action and the United United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She's also a drummer in a women's drumming circle called Ogichi or Warrior Women, and works closely with an organization called We Matter as an ambassador of hope. And so we're so lucky today to have Jenna join us and to share her expertise as well. With that, it's my pleasure to hand off the microphone or the floor to Jenna to begin to start.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Delasi. I'm Jenna Robar, and I'm joining you from Chipuktuk, or Halifax, which is in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional unceded present and future home of the Mi'kmaq, or the Ilnuk. I am from Unama'ki, the land of the fog, or known as Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, one of the most beautiful places in what's known as Canada, on Turtle Island. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm so excited to share a little bit with you folks. You know, when I was asked to join the panel, I was given the choice of speaking under this umbrella theme, and I joined right away. I jumped at the chance to speak about international policy on Indigenous peoples, and this is something that I have researched and studied over the years throughout my degree, and even continuing in my work with the government to now. So while we only have time to do a glance over, I would love it if you could find something in the next few minutes that you can take and dive a bit deeper into outside of our time together. It's so interesting, honestly. Like when I was doing some notes to prepare for today, I was like, dang, this is so interesting, and there's so much here, and really, how could you not want to know more about this subject? So we have a few things to cover. So to take us to the next slide, to jump in. Yeah. To jump in, we're going to zoom into 4 different areas around the world and go over some similarities and differences when it comes to colonization, which it's very interesting. Like I said, the policies that apply to Indigenous peoples in these areas, and take a dip into international policy and how respective governments are doing with those and how we can move forward. There are some bonus resources at the end that I will just love speaking about. So let's get to it. So the next slide. Yeah. So zooming into 4 areas here, you can see Canada, Brazil, the Philippines, and New Zealand. I tried to mix it up a bit. I had some more in my head, but I said, let's just go with these 4. Okay, let's start with Brazil. So a little bit about the colonization history is what I want to touch on a little bit before we really get started. So in Brazil, the Portuguese accidentally found and then colonized what's known as Brazil, starting in the early 1500s and starting with trade with Indigenous peoples. War was later declared on the Indigenous peoples by the Portuguese king, and the efforts were later made to convert everyone to Christianity. And anyone who didn't was enslaved and trafficked on sugar plantations. So let's take a look to the right over at the Philippines. The Igorot people are the Indigenous peoples there who resisted and fought against Spanish colonizers for over 300 years. And they were met with divide and rule tactics as the Spanish tried and failed to locate gold. Instead, they made it their mission to convert people to Christianity there as well. Look down to New Zealand. The start of colonization was in 1769 with Christian missionaries in the 1830s, and you can already see a theme here. The New Zealand Company, which you can almost think of as the Hudson's Bay Company if you're in what's known as Canada, forced the confiscation of land at low prices to upsell to settlers who were arriving more and more to New Zealand. New Zealand, who may be changing their name back to their traditional name soon, which is big news that just came out this week. They also faced unfair treaties with the British colonizers, various diseases, violence for speaking their language in schools, among other tragic events. And some of this may sound familiar because at home in Canada, what's known as Canada, we too have a very dark history of residential schools, the 60s scoop, very unfair treaties, forced confiscation of land and resources on top of other acts of violence known as genocide today. We could talk about this for months, really. We could research and dive into this for months and months. But these areas and many more that are the traditional ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples, they have faced colonization, conquest, or met with dangerous resistance when trying to defend their land, their people, their way of life. And many have seen unjust treaties, and as settler populations grew, the rights and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples have been ignored or pushed to the bottom of a country's, an area, a state's priority list. So if we go to the next slide, working with government. So I myself work with the government, and I know that it's an internal battle sometimes to work for the very institution that has done so much wrong in the past and continues to not get it right so often. Let's say working in policy within government like I do, I get to compare and contrast often, and I often dream one day of having more progressive policies like New Zealand, where Māori became an official language in 1987. You can see how progressive they are. The language is fiercely promoted, protected, endorsed all around the country of what's known as New Zealand. I wish we had land policies like they do in South America, because countries in Latin America and Africa have the strongest laws protecting Indigenous land rights. And that's because many follow what's known as FPIC. FPIC being free, prior, and informed consent, which is recognized by the United Nations, and it applies to Indigenous peoples all over the world. It means that the government or land grabbers can't take over Indigenous traditional territories. It's something that's very important, but isn't followed regularly. It isn't followed very often in what's known as Canada, the United States. But if we look at places like Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, they follow FPIC a little bit more closely. So their land is more protected than our Indigenous traditional territories here in Turtle Island. This also means that Indigenous peoples' land ownership rights are recognized under international laws. So states cannot relocate Indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent, without at least offering them adequate compensation. And if we turn back to think about what I just said about the Philippines, the Philippine Constitution states that all lands and all resources are owned by the government. So just as a quick comparison, what I just said about FPIC, the Philippines doesn't apply to them because in their constitution, everything is owned by the government, even the water. So policy exists to improve social, political, and even economic status. But the disadvantage here stems from historical abuse of Indigenous peoples with little healing or transfer of power. And as we talk about politics and government, my mind usually, always, goes to health and well-being. So if you think about the role of the government in influencing population health, it's not just limited to the health sector. So it's not just limited to Health Canada per se. It's also various sectors outside of that. So think of, this is one of my favorite topics actually, if you think of social determinants of health, SDH. Though Those social determinants of health are the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. So those are the conditions that you're born in, that you grow up in, that you live in. Those are social determinants of health, and to me, that is formed by the government. So thinking about this, thinking about health outcomes, how do you think health outcomes would be for Indigenous peoples if those social determinants of health were in the past and even into the present abuse and genocide and violence, and always getting the short end of the stick, and always, you know, faced with decisions that are unfair, to say the least? What are those social determinants of health? So I want you to just sit with that for a little bit. I'd love some questions about it at the end. But finally, as we talk about UNDRIP tonight, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, let's think about applying it to our own home here in what's known as Canada, where in 2007, we, along with New Zealand and the United States, rejected the declaration and only had that decision overturned in 2016. Canada is known as being a caring country, which many would agree with, but taking a look back at all this past injustice, much of it carries over into our present. We are symbolic with our words and apologies instead of showing reflection through policy and change. We in Canada will apologize for genocide, but still operate under the Indian Act of 1876. Canada suffers from a token humanitarianism. We offer our humanitarian aid, but we also tend to be a part of the stem issue that led to the disasters. Within the UNDRIP, as many of us know, there are 46 articles that recognize the basic human rights of Indigenous peoples and the right to self-determination, as well as creating our own education systems, restitution for stolen land, and decision-making that affects Indigenous peoples. It was the 2007 government that chose to reject this declaration to recognize human rights. Think about this on Monday when everyone goes to vote. This leads me into moving forward. So the next slide. What can we do for Indigenous policy? And to this, I say, everyone has a role. You showing up here to acquire this knowledge, you doing your own research and passing it on is part of the solution. You voting with this topic in mind Monday is part of moving forward. Whether you're interested in politics, in sports, in the arts, you can be part of doing something good and right, whatever your role is. And what I have to say to you tonight is, I hope that you absorb this information, and if you have a voice, you need to use it. So with that, I will leave you with the last slide. And please take a picture if you like, because these are some amazing organizations that I've worked with, and I encourage you to look them up. The first one being We Matter. I'm a little biased. I'm an ambassador of hope for the past 3 years since they first started, but tonight is all about sharing. Tonight is all about education. So if you folks are ever looking for speakers, for example, to talk about anything, to talk about food systems, to talk about clean water, to talk about being a leader in communities. There are so many amazing folks that are young Indigenous peoples who would love to speak on these topics. And the next one being First Nations Child and Family. Work with them in the past, and they're an amazing organization. And the last one is actually based in Toronto, and they're all about healing Indigenous youth. So I leave you here. I hope that you take pictures and you have lots of questions. And I am so happy to be here with you all tonight and to hear our next speaker and to engage in dialogue with you all. Thank you so much. Walalio.
Thanks sincerely, Jenna. It's such a pleasure and honor to have you here and to hear from you and your expertise and your lived experience. I think that's something that's been really resonating with me as I hear from so many young Indigenous people, Indigenous elders, Indigenous experts, is just the value of how much lived experience is as important, if not more important, than academic or work experience. So thank you so much for sharing all of that, and also the common threads that are evident across the world of colonization and displacement and theft and harm. So with that, I think, like you said, it's important to hold this, but we have more to hear. So I would like to hand it off to Skaydu.û to take the reins now.
Great, thank you so much. Ganesh for letting me speak today. I first want to start off with a land acknowledgement. I'm coming from right now I want to acknowledge that right now I am on the unceded traditional territory of the Uconn, Tantaquan, and Sheetkaquan on the Tlingit Ani, also known as Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka, Alaska. I'm in Juneau today. So the reason I do this acknowledgement is because it's a traditional respect that's said to honor the people and the land of this territory, and it's a way of reconciling for, the treaties that weren't honored in the past and how important that policy kind of is. So moving forward, I'll just leave you with that because I'll come back to it later. So if we can go to the Sorry, was I muted that whole time?
We lost you just after the land acknowledgement.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. And so so I'm just going to first introduce myself. So Dain Yagi Owe Yak Ayok Satini, Skaydu.û Chatdu Autum Jules Skaydu.û, Achlish du Kla Skaydu.û Chatdu Ka Graphy Jules Skaydu.û. Yanda Shani Florence Johnson, Yudu Sago, Nuchat USA, Dakla Shah Ayachat, Kleka Darun Tauk Akatagu, Nashada Hani Techun, Judu Sauk, Cod Late Dugsmart Senior Gleka Henach, Roch Nach Saisati, Teslin Kwan Ayachat, Zintakahini Aya Ye Chat Yati. Hashlinget Hashagun Kahakustin Hashaguk Ka Hashlinget Yuchatangi Yuchayatank Nahashaguk Akla you Kagane you do a self Connie Jules Glake Kachenach Ach Kla Schlinget Yuchatangi Ku Atletum Ach City Ashlish Akla du Kla Kashta Kla you do a self mini Jules Glake Kachenach Ashlish du Kla Skaydu.û you do Salgun Graphy Jules Glake Kachenach and Ashlish du Kla Skaydu.û Graphy Jules Glake Kachenach Gunnach Chishach Isa Achi Gunnach Chish Hatin Adi. So in most cases I wouldn't translate just because it creates an opportunity for questions and whatnot, but just in this sense today, so you can understand a little bit of where I am, where I'm from and what I'm saying. I just said, it's a beautiful day. It's good to see all of you. My Tlingit name is Skaydu.û and Autum Jules in English. I'm named after my grandma's mom, Skaydu.û Graphy Jules. Elder Florence Johnson named me so. I'm a woman of the Eagle clan. They used to call my clan leader Tate Hunch and late Doug's March Senior in English. My moiety is Wolf. I am from the Teslin Tlingit people, and right now I'm living in Juneau. I am learning to speak our Tlingit language, and I'm learning our ways and our culture. My mother's Tlingit name is Kagane, and her English name is Connie Jules, and my mother is a Tlingit teacher. My grandma, my mom's mom, Tlingit name is Kashtak Kla, and her English name is Minnie Jules. And my grandma's mom, they used to call her Skaydu.û, late Mary Graphy Jules in English. Thank you all for listening to me, and thank you all for coming. And thank you for letting me give that space and to set the tone for my presentation today. It's very important in my culture to be able to recognize where I came from and honor my ancestor and my teachers and my family, and especially the matriarchs, as it is so important moving forward because it shows where I want to go. If we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so just a little bit like in the English, I honored a lot of my matriarch. That's my clan totem pole right there on the far right, on the very top. It's of an eagle, because as I am a woman of the Eagle clan. So along my journey, I always want to honor my matriarchs in my family because that's very important moving forward. There's me and my mom working on a moose skin, and my grandma and my great grandma, and then my auntie on the far left, and me just doing subsistence hunting out on the land. So if we could go to the next slide. Yeah, so my journey, I just like to share different beautiful pictures of different parts of the traditional territories in the Yukon because I find they're so unique and beautiful. So this is of Yukon Peel watershed in the Trondek-Hwichin, Notchanayak Dun, and Gwich'in Tribal Council in Bunta-Gwich'in First Nation traditional territory. So I'd like to share this while I talk about my journey and what brought me here today. A few years ago, I always considered this moment in time that was my catalyst. I was struggling like so many other Indigenous youth with drugs, alcohol, my mental health and well-being. I was very disconnected from my land, from my elders. And actually this opportunity was brought to me by a creator, and it was the International Internship for Indigenous Youth Program. So I went and moved from my community of 300 people in Teslin, Uconn to a city of 3 million in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. I got into this internship program against all odds, and I thought it was unbelievable, but it was just meant to be, and I did my best, and that was worth it, I guess. And so while over there, I planted trees. I was kind of a jack of all trades, but I taught English, which was a very eye-opening thing for me because I had to learn their traditional language of Khmer enough to teach. And I was like, you know, if I can learn this like very hard tongue twisting language, why am I not learning my own? So that moment in time, I also got my first experience with Indigenous sovereignty, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and really got to connect with our Indigenous allies across the world. So when I came home, I hit the ground running. It was kind of my catalyst. I immediately started doing different things with Northern Council for Global Cooperation. I started working with GPI Atlantic, which is based in Nova Scotia, and doing just everything and anything to spread the word about how amazing this program was and how much it changed my life and almost saved me in a way. And at the same time, simultaneously, I was committed to learning my language. So every single Friday, I would drive 2 hours, rain, shine, or snowstorm to round trip. It would be 4 hours a week to go learn my language in Whitehorse, which is the capital of the Yukon Territory. So I had this fire burning in my heart, and I still do. And it was a really big reconnection journey for me because with language, everything else follows: land stewardship, your culture, and connections with your elders, connections with your community. It was all just coming together, and it never had for me before that time. I had another opportunity where I moved to Nova Scotia to the Mi'kmaq traditional territory for the Indigenous Women and Community Leadership Program. And I got to connect with different Indigenous women from across Turtle Island. And that was truly eye-opening because I was like, wow, we are like these strong matriarchs. Like, how come there's not more outsources and more opportunities for us to be leaders within our community? But now one of those women that were in the program with me, she's actually the first Tlicho Indigenous woman chief. So like the times are changing and things are moving, and that's pretty exciting to be a part of. As well as I always fight for intersectionality, and I really was eye-opened to the world issue of gender equality when I got to go to the Women Deliver conference in Vancouver. I think it was 2019, and actually a few other of the International Internship for Indigenous Youth Program people also was able to come and be a part of that as well, and really opening our eyes to the sustainable development goals and how important they are. But I always like to switch it and add in a little bit of an Indigenous lens to that. And so that leads me more to now. I've been doing like lots of this and that over the years since that program, but I'm actually a part of this fellowship called the Yukon First Nations Climate Action Fellowship. And it really has been teaching us to deal with policy and to deal and build our capacity as future leaders and building that confidence and strength to speak like I am today. To be able to get out on the land. I got my first moose last year. It was super exciting, and doing different things like that and just really supporting us as each individual, because we're all coming from different backgrounds. Even though we're all Indigenous, we all have diverse backgrounds as well. We're not grouped into the same pile all the time. We all come from different backgrounds and different issues that we're facing and different barriers. And it's really eye-opening because we're from 14 different Uconn First Nations in the Uconn territory, and like how eye-opening it is to be able to be like, wow, we're all going through these different things, but we're all together in solidarity. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So understanding policy, it's funny that I put this on here because policy, I don't really understand policy too well. It's a learning process. And it was hard for me to admit that in the beginning, but I'm honest now about it. There's so much policies to understand, and there's so many ways to kind of go about being able to understand and kind of break it down to something that, somebody like myself who immediately sees policy and wants to turn away, but to be able to confront it and be like, if policy is so important to understand and analyze, because without understanding policy, how can you affect change? There's so much like UNDRIP, like Jenna was saying, and the umbrella final agreement in the Uconn, the Indian Act that, that still affects us today. There's all these different policies, and without understanding them and being able to integrate them and being able to change them, you need to understand them to be able to be like, hey, we need to amend that, or we need to change that because that's not working. And so it's so important. And I only discovered this because of the fellowship that I'm in. Immediately, like they were doing a training on policy and I was like, I don't want to go to that, but I did, and I confronted it, and it was so important. And it was a really big moment for me, because I was like, wow, policy is super important. And that's pretty much all I can say on policy because I'm still learning about it. So if we could go to the next slide. I really like this phrase, and it really speaks to my general theme of my presentation today, and it was, we must embody the future we seek. So I think embodying the future is really like, how can you do that? How can you embody the future we seek? Because each individual is so different, but I think so important is to collaboration, is to support collaboration and to work with lateral kindness. And as Jenna was saying, I think self-determination, right? It's all about being able to have your goals set in mind and being able to work united as well. And I think a big part in embodying the future we seek is working together with our Indigenous allies across the globe. And it's very eye-opening to me, because before I left my community of 300 people, I was like, wow, Indigenous people are only to Canada. And then going to Cambodia, I'm like, wow, Indigenous people are everywhere. I wonder how come we don't have this like network where we can work together on a more united front. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So Indigenous sovereignty. I also love this picture. This is one of my friend's traditional territory that we went back on a quad on. And this is Kwanlin First Nation traditional territory. So this is my sub for Indigenous sovereignty. And the way that I didn't really understand Indigenous sovereignty too much until a couple of years ago, until I was like thrown right into Indigenous sovereignty when going over and working with Cambodian Volunteers for Society, and really being able to work and learn and grow and unlearn some things as well while working with Indigenous people in Cambodia. To be able to, sometimes you have to like put your values and put your things at the forefront to be able to respect somebody else, or to be able to come and show up in a polite way to other people's, because there's some things that aren't the same here that they are there, and just to be able to respect that and come from like a cross-cultural understanding of that. Every culture is different, and the sovereignty might look different from their culture to our culture. So to be able to really come together as allies is being able to understand where they're coming from and their laws and their values, their religion, and then it's the same as their responsibility to also try to understand our values, our culture and our ways. And that's a really hard thing to do, but it's really beautiful when it comes together. And I really got to experience that firsthand when living in Phnom Penh for 4 months for this program. And it really was eye-opening because I was like, wow, we have such similar issues. As Jenna was saying, there was colonization, there was all these different genocides. I know genocide's always a hard topic, but it's something important because you need to know the truth to be able to move forward and reconcile. For like the truth and reconciliation, you need to know the truth first. And so to be able to be like, wow, there's all these different people around the world that went through the same things that we're doing, but we're all at different parts in it. And how can we step up and support one another for that? And I think this program is a very great to get your foot in the door. And I'm always trying to spread the good word about this program because it's pretty amazing. So if we could go to the next slide. So again, there's this quote that I really like about truth and reconciliation that kind of always opened up my eyes to it because it's such a big topic, and where do you start with it? So if there's to be reconciliation, first there must be truth. And that's so true. And how do you do that? Like, how do you take that on? So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I feel as though for truth and reconciliation, I can only speak from my perspective as a Uconn First Nation, Teslin Tlingit person, that I think that if we want to go to the truth, that's a big part about learning, and to learn from the grassroots people, from the masters, from the people that have been doing it since the time of millennia, and how to go about that. So I think that's something that each person has their own responsibility to learn the history of the land that they reside on, or the history of the land of the people that they work with, to learn as much as they can about the traditional law, because it's definitely different than the contemporary westernized law. The values, as it's always nice to be able to know where something might not make sense to you, but if you understand the values and the protocols of that First Nation or that Indigenous peoples, it'll make you understand a lot where they're coming from. And of course, the teachings and the oral traditions. I think that's so an overlooked thing sometimes, because there's always that westernized curriculum that's always pushed and pushed, but how do we honor and how do we branch out and teach the traditional holistic teachings? Because this past year of me learning my language, or I've been learning my language for about 3 years now. And what's that has opened up for me has been a lot. Also, like I'm in university right now, so I obviously believe in the westernized curriculum as well, but how do we balance that? How do we honor both? And how do we acknowledge both? Which is a big part of Indigenous like ways of being, is acknowledgement. So if we could go on to the next slide. And so my last kind of thought that I'll leave you with, and we can kind of talk a little bit more about it in the breakout rooms, but is to how to be an ally. And the way that I go about that is the way that when I talk about how to be an ally, I always think of like when I was a 14-year-old youth sitting on a council and how like daunting that was. I was almost there for a seat warmer, to not speak and just be there to listen, which is good in a sense, but eventually how are you going to learn to speak if you don't have the opportunity to speak and have the opportunity to grow? So I always believe that there's strength in numbers, that when there's a youth opportunity, you should get more than one youth to be there and to be present, because I know definitely firsthand when there was other youth there, you feel the confidence to be able to be like, hey, we all agree on this, let's speak to it. And then resource sharing as well, and being able to be like, we're all kind of working towards this common goal. How come we don't work together and not do that work twice? And being able to combine those silos and cut down a barrier that's kind of unneeded, and to definitely stay away from tokenism. We're not there to just check the box. We're not there to fill the seat. We all have very strong individual voices and come from individual backgrounds, and to be able to hear just even a couple of us today, and that we're both coming from different traditional territories and different teachings and different backgrounds. There's so many voices to be heard, and to give space for that, and to be able to create and cultivate a good, healthy space that uplifts us and with lateral love. So I'll end it with that. So Gunashish, and thank you for listening.
Sorry, everybody, technical difficulties. I always say it's not an online event unless there are technical difficulties, but thank you so much to Skaydu.û for sharing that and for sharing your own experience so fulsomely, so holistically, and also for giving us a peek into your territory and the territory of your friends and the experiences that you have had. And I see people in the chat too. Thank you so much for sharing your language and your gifts with us. It's such an honor to have you here and to have both you and Jenna here today. We do have some time, actually more time than anticipated, to invite folks to ask any questions. So I would like to open the floor now if there's anyone who would like to unmute yourself or to drop a question in the chat, or to share any thoughts or moments of appreciation for our panelists today.
I'll just start by saying I am such a fan. That was such a great talk and presentation, and I just wrote a little private note to you in the chat, but man, what a great night. And I just want to say thank you so much for showing up and being so authentic and genuine, and we need more of this in the world, and I just want to thank you for joining today.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to come from different backgrounds and different places and being able to connect, because it just shows that there's so many opportunities for collaboration. I'll definitely be messaging you and connecting with you, because it's great to be able to hear different experiences and different stories. I like hearing about the different stories and experiences, and you could definitely tell your passion going into it when you're presenting, and I really enjoyed that. So thank you as well for sharing. Thank
you both. I don't see any questions just yet from the audience. So once again, please feel free to drop any thoughts or questions in the chat or unmute yourself at any point, but maybe I can start off for both of you. I guess I'm sitting in this place of who are the best people to learn from. I'm sure you've had many mentors and elders and role models in your own place, and I'm also cautious in my own journey of asking Indigenous people to teach me, right? It's this balance of course, I want to learn from them and learn from what's already out there, but also I don't want to center myself and I don't want to demand the emotional labor. So where or how do you recommend for those of us that have some knowledge or would like to know more, where can we find those resources, or who do you recommend we can learn from? And I don't mean reach out to, but watch YouTube videos or things like that. Maybe I'll leave it there to start off.
Well, Ellen, for the question, I see someone else, Amal, had the same question in the chat too. Something I always say when folks have similar questions is to start with what you're interested in, start where and start with what you love. So if you're someone who loves sports, who are the Indigenous athletes, or what is the history of lacrosse or hockey? If you're interested in arts, there are so many Indigenous artists, no matter where you are, Turtle Island or beyond, who would benefit from your support, or politics, or literature, wherever your interest lies. I would always say to start there. And something that I always recommend is the course that was put on by University of Alberta on Indigenous life and culture. I'm not sure, Indigenous peoples in Canada, maybe it's called. That's a great place to start, but start with your heart, start with what you love and what you're going to be interested in.
Okay, goodness, geez, Jenna, that was great. Yeah, I love that. Starting with your heart and starting with what you love. I definitely wholeheartedly agree with that. I think who are the best people to learn from? I can only talk from my like Indigenous lens experience, and obviously the highest one for me on the list would be elders. But how do you not overwhelm, or how do you do that in a really respectful, traditional knowledge-led way? I always, for elders, you know, you just like love them up because they're so priceless and they're so beautiful and amazing, and they're so full of wisdom, and there's many elders that are always willing to share, but how do you honor them? And always bring them lots of salmon and moose meat and any traditional food as like a nice little like present or like gift for them, because their knowledge that you give, like how can you honor them really for that, because it's just so powerful and so amazing. But also in like this COVID world that we live in, going to elders right now is a little too risky because they're so important to us and important for our culture and our communities. Like they're the glue that keeps us together, and they're the pillars that keep us strong. So I think the notes that I was writing down were like a lot of online resources, that there's so many online resources, but to make sure, you know, that they're from sources that aren't telling them as like as their own kind of experience. You know, if it's going to be a lot different if it's coming from an anthropologist to somebody who is actually Indigenous. So it's important to be able to understand that, and being able to be like, oh, okay, this person might have not been Indigenous, and so they skewed how that actually happened, or how it was actually portrayed. And I really noticed that, like once I'm in university and using stories and stuff like that, to one that was written by an anthropologist, or one that was recorded by somebody who was just speaking, you know, and who was speaking in their holistic kind of mother tongue. So sometimes the English is a little bit broken, but it's all about interpretation and being able to interpret that in your best way possible, and to just be like as respectful as you can. In the last couple of years before I moved here to go to university, I worked at a heritage center. So a heritage center is a little bit different than a museum. We're more for like learning, and being able to share different history and different events, and a lot about our culture and our art and our stories. And a big part of learning Indigenous stories, you learn a lot about what happened and the different things about the community, and you learn about the values and the protocols and everything that I spoke of before. So I find that heritage centers are, and usually every community has something like a heritage center or like a learning center, or something like that, because they want to be able to share our version of our story, right? Rather than it being told from all these different perspectives that might not be our story. And then the last one is kind of my little one that I'm always like, wow, it really like opens up my mind and kind of pushes me to relearn some things or unlearn some things, or just open my mind up to different opportunities and different perspectives, is Instagram, actually. There's like lots of really innovative artists and like young Indigenous people that are really utilizing Instagram to really share their voices and really skew perspectives and really shake up things. And it's definitely been blowing my mind. And some people just like say some things that I'm like, wow, they're just like the deepest, most like beautiful quotes that you'd ever hear, and you'd never seen them anywhere before. And somebody was just sharing it on Instagram with a picture. And so it's definitely a lot of teaching moments, especially with everything that's been happening recently. Instagram's been a very good resource and a very good way for people to share how they're feeling about everything that's going on. And I think that's so important moving forward. So, Ganesh.
Thank you. Very, very fruitful and rich responses. I think it's already given us a lot to start with. Is there anyone else who has any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or drop one in the chat.
I actually have a question. So my question is, what does true reconciliation look like in the Canadian context, or what do you think it will look like?
I guess I can go first. That's such a big question. I'm still trying to navigate that myself. I think about, like I said before in that quote that I said, with truth and reconciliation, there first must be truth and being able to honor the truth. And that's almost not happening as much as it should in Canada specifically, especially with everything that's going on. The truth is not being honored and the truth is not being learned. And it's just kind of, they're trying to close that chapter and open up another one. So I think that has to be probably the first step, and not just, it should be like an individual thing too, but I think it needs to be more of like a government wide being able to be like, yeah, a little bit more on this happened and we can't move forward unless we heal and work with our mental health and do all these different things, do A, B, and C, because we can't really reconcile. Because I know a lot of Indigenous youth specifically that I've been surrounded with aren't really happy with how things are going. And especially with, it's almost like not even talked about on social media anymore. And so I think that's probably my best advice, because I'm only 24 years old too, so I'm still learning, but that's what I think has to happen moving forward, because there's still so much unrest over everything that there needs to be some sort of like truth ceremony or some like a way to go about it, but through a traditional knowledge lens. With our elders, like, and our youth along side by side leading that. So thank you.
Well, Alan, when I think of reconciliation, the word, I think of one of my friends who is an amazing writer, Riley Yesno. So many of you folks may know Riley. Riley said, Canada can't say it believes in reconciliation because it's made it clear to us time and time again that it doesn't. So I believe in reconciliation. I believe in the movement. I believe in this future. Do I believe that the government is working towards reconciliation? I would say that more times than not, there's more lip service than action. There's more reflection than action. So when I think of reconciliation, I don't think of the government. I think of sparks and I think of little fires around what's known as Canada and around Turtle Island that are progressing towards reconciliation. And just like you said, before reconciliation, there must be truth. And there must be a truth ceremony. There must be something, some important commemoration, some important time in our future as what's known as Canada to honor the truth. Yes, thank you for posting the link of Riley's amazing work. There are little fires, little sparks all around Turtle Island, but some say reconciliation is dead. Some say there's a halt. Some say we're working towards it every day. I like to think the last one, because there are people that are working towards this every single day. There are people whose careers, whose lives have been dedicated towards this relationship. It is a relationship, and so many young folks, A, have given up, or B, are trying, and the spark can be lit again to try for this better, improved relationship with the government, with what's known as Canada, with who are known as Canadians. So I believe in it, and that's what I think of it. But just like we mentioned tonight, it goes hand in hand. There's no one without the other. There's no truth without reconciliation. There's no moving forward without all of us. So thank you for the question, Walalio.
Thank you so much. Maybe we have time to take one more question or comment from the audience.
Hi, I have a question. I'm Shatabdi, and I want to thank you both for your presentations. They were both so insightful and wonderful. And you both sort of touched on the ideas of performative activism and also its relationship with social media. And I think we've all sort of seen the way that social media seems to work is we do learn a lot, but it is sort of in a way of becoming performative activism. And so how do we sort of use social media for the good, but then not do the performative activism part as well? I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Well, Alan, thank you so much. When I hear that term, I think of the ice bucket challenge. Does anyone remember that? The ice bucket challenge, where you and your friends or family members would get nominated and you'd have to put the ice bucket over your head. It was all a fundraiser, right? It was all supposed to be a fundraiser, but it turns out many folks didn't actually donate. They just wanted to do it for social media and just say, oh, I threw a bucket of ice over my head, which is fine, but that wasn't the point, you know? It was for ALS. So when I think of performative activism, allyship, whatever it is, it's the face, right? It's what you want to see on social media. It's the scroll, it's the like. I will say there's something to it, you know? Millions of dollars were raised because of that ice bucket challenge, even though everyone didn't donate. And lots of information research was able to be done because of what went viral. So there is something to it. It's not exactly what we need, right? We need people who are ungovernment and who are saying, you know, this is not just lip service, this is action, this is meaningful, and we're working together. But when something's performative, like when you say, okay, I'm going to give this sandwich to this houseless person on the street, can you take a video? Is that helping or is that hurting? Or is it both? So it just begs the question of what you're doing. Is what you're doing helping or hurting, or is it both? So that's where I just kind of turn the question back. And I know I've questioned even myself on it in the past, even being Indigenous. And I'm like, wow, am I just posting this just to post this? Or, you know, wherever it will be on Instagram or on Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but you know, sometimes good intentions are all that people can offer. I appreciate the question, and I do see both sides. I think I'll leave it there. I think there's a both sides, and you kind of have to weigh your intentions and weigh the hurt and the healing, the hurt and the helping, whatever it is, before you make those actions. And it does lead to burnout sometimes too, if you're always posting these things and you're always trying your hardest. So it's kind of you have to pick and choose where you can be the most helpful and the most healing. So I'll leave it there. Walalin.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. I also am, I don't know, I'm like, I feel like there is some power behind social media, but how to not be like using it in the best way, because there's so many things that are detrimental to social media as well. They could take a lot of the essence and a lot of the feeling out of things, kind of like cell phones, kind of like, you know, Zoom, but there also are power to it as well. Now we don't have to have a runner in between our villages and run our, you know, communications from village to village. There's a power in being able to connect like simultaneously. But how to do that in a good way is a really great question. I think everyone should listen or follow Shayla Stonechild on Instagram. I think she's the perfect example of an influencer that has these powerful values, and she really uses her platform, and she's like an Indigenous influencer that fills this space in such a good, holistic way that is so empowering and like motivating, and she really like makes like Indigenous peoples proud to be Indigenous. And so there's a certain like power behind that, but she also has a podcast. So there's a way to like go about things that you're like, okay, now I'm only seeing pictures and I want to know more content, and she's providing that in another source. So I think when there's that nice segue where you can kind of go and like learn more, and there's opportunities to do that, and that could also help with the previous question. And if you want to learn more about Indigenous peoples, podcasts are an amazing way to do that. I love podcasts. But yeah, I think there's that kind of example. I can only speak to like the people that I follow and I really look up to, because they really show like my values are kind of aligned with them. So that's why I follow them, and that's why I always like them and like support them and comment and everything like that. But there's a way to do that in a good, healthy way that's not like chasing that like, or chasing that because social media is addictive. It's so addictive. I don't know if you've ever tried to do a social media cleanse. It is hard. So to be able to kind of go about it, but in a way that's healthy, and you're like, I think a way to go about it is like lateral kindness, right? Just to be there to support one another and hold each other up. But sometimes it just doesn't look like that. So I guess it's just being careful and how to navigate that. But I think if you were to follow Shayla Stochild, she's a game changer for me. And she was like, okay, wow, that's a good way to go about using social media. Because she doesn't only share her words, but she shares the words of her elders and the words of people that have also held her up, right? And so it's this like interconnected web of all of these different really powerful people. And I think that's a really amazing way to go about it. So thank you.
Thank you both. I think it's very easy for us to continue to hold this space and ask so many questions, but I also want us to have the opportunity to break out into smaller groups and hold this space in a different way. And so I will actually invite Kyle, who's supporting us today, to open up breakout rooms where all of you will have the opportunity to speak with Skaydu.û and Jenna more intimately, and to also discuss some of the ways that you can take action in your community and hear from their expertise and their knowledge. You will be using a Jamboard, so I will be dropping the link to the Jamboard in the chat. So feel free to jump on into that. But with that, oh, and the other note is that these breakout sessions will not be recorded, so please feel free to engage as holistically and as authentically as you'd like, and as frankly as you feel the need to be. Nothing is really off limits here. So with that, I will invite Kyle to open up the breakout rooms, and I will see you folks again in about 15 to 20 minutes to debrief.
I can kind of speak. Yeah, I can kind of speak to what we, the questions kind of that we kind of went through on our breakout room, if that's okay. Yeah, so I think a big question that we kind of took most of the time to talk about it is how to be a better ally and not like overshadow Indigenous voices. And what kind of came up with that was we got some really good answers to that. And it was share resources and avoid gatekeeping, decentralize yourself, your narrative, amplify the voices of Indigenous youth, actively supporting Indigenous businesses, influencers, stories, and voices, and educate yourself, learning from Indigenous scholars. And then lastly, going to Indigenous events, connecting to local organizations that amplify voices in the community, reading, learning, and unlearning, and donating and investing. Action with money. So that was kind of a big, like most of our conversation kind of took up that, like talking about most of those topics and how to not overshadow Indigenous youth as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Is there maybe anyone from the breakout room who would like to share their own reflections or thoughts as well? I love awkward silences, so we can sit here until somebody is brave enough. looks like I'm on the losing end of this game of chicken. So we can move on to Jenna's breakout room. Jenna, yourself or anyone from your room, please feel free to share kind of what your thoughts or your takeaways were.
I can
Yeah, come on, group 2.
Sorry, Jen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can just comment. I'm just going to leave my video off because my Wi-Fi is getting a little bit shaky. But hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth, and I'm calling today from Mi'kma'ki in Windsor, Nova Scotia. And so one thing in our breakout group that we talked about was free, prior, and informed consent and what that could actually look like in practice. And I believe it was Caitlin in our breakout group, but please correct me if I'm wrong about that, who talked about her work and decolonizing the mental health space and how free, prior, and informed consent exists at many different levels. It isn't just a one and done kind of process. So that was really like educational, really eye-opening for me to hear. So I want to thank Caitlin for sharing that. Yeah, and I'd invite anyone else from the breakout room to comment as well.
I assume that means that there are no further comments from that group. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing those thoughts. Well, with that, folks, it is my absolute pleasure to once again thank our speakers from today, both Skaydu.û and Jenna, as well as Sarah, who unfortunately, like I mentioned, wasn't able to be here with us today. I hope that we are exactly 2 weeks away from the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and I hope that this session has given you some ways to move forward, some food for thought, some ideas or concrete actions that you can take as allies, as Indigenous peoples, or as allies to Indigenous people in solidarity with them as well. I want to remind you that if you enjoyed today's session, this is the second in a series of 5, so please do jump onto the Eventbrite where you registered for this session and register for our event on food security sovereignty, from ideas to action, or our hackathon. We hope that we will continue to keep an Indigenous lens and invite more Indigenous speakers as a cross-cutting perspective, and not just Indigenous speakers speak to truth and reconciliation, but actually we need to embrace Indigenous bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing across all topics. And so if you did enjoy today's session, if you enjoyed today's style, if you enjoyed today's topic, I do strongly encourage you to join us for our other events. But before we say goodbye, I do have a quick poll that I do want to launch, and I invite you all just to share your thoughts, your reflections, your learnings from today. Super quick, it's only about 7 or 8 questions, and it's completely anonymous, so please do share your responses. And then with that, it is my absolute pleasure to close the second session of the Policy Matters series. And I look forward to seeing you folks on October 21st for a session on food security and sovereignty. Thank you all, and thank you again to our incredible speakers. Round of applause for all of you.